Okay, so tonight, Be'ezras Hashem, we're going to be continuing our series of shirim on entering into the sea of wisdom. And we're going to continue studying the teachings of the Tzaddik, the Gaon Rav Yitzchak Meyer Morgenstern Shlita, Tzaddik whose base medrash is found in Yerushalayim. And Be'ezras Hashem, what we're going to try and look at tonight is we're going to be looking at a nakuda that has come up in the past. It's certainly, for those of you who have listened to me in the past, know that this is a nakuda that's very shaykh to my leiv. But there are times when the Rebbe brings it down, and when they bring it down in Likutei Divrei Elokim Chayim, in the collected teachings from the Rebbe's table, that it just becomes so clear, and it connects different tzaddikim across the spectrum of history, as the Rebbe is uniquely capable of doing, to kind of bring out a nakuda. But the hakdama that we have to have for understanding the nakuda that the Rebbe is going to be bringing out is that b'derech klal, the Jewish people are considered banim atem la'Hashem Elokechem, that the Jewish nation, Metzias, existence itself, is considered to relate to the two lower configurations or partsufim that the Arizal described. Now, we're not getting into what the Arizal meant or even what the Arizal says, but suffice it to say that the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh's interpretation and retranslation, so to speak, of the teachings of the Arizal create for us a vision that we have a shaykhus, a relationship with two spiritual ideas, two spiritual archetypes. One is going to be called Zer Anpin and one is going to be called Malchus. Now, b'derech klal, these two elements of Zer Anpin and Malchus, or Kudsha Barichu, the transcendent element of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Shchinte, the imminent presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world, our job is to unify or to reveal the inherent unity that always already exists between Zer Anpin and Malchus, between the Torah in its masculine expressivity and between tephila in its feminine receptivity. And these ideas can find numerous or nearly innumerable nodal points or kind of metaphors that can allow them to be understood in a more practical kind of lived experience type of way. But typically speaking, we relate as individuals, both masculine and feminine. We relate to the concept of Zer Anpin. Zer Anpin is the idea of Torah. It's the idea of the desire for fullness and the idea of accomplishment, understanding, knowledge, and to have some sort of expertise and grasp over reality. Malchus, on the other hand, which is something we've discussed numerous times, is nearly the polar opposite, associated with the feminine capacity of severity and constriction, withholding for the sake of propelling forward, which at first glance appears to be empty, but when peered at through a deeper lens appears to be so full that it could only appear as empty. But Malchus is the idea of chisaron, of lack, of deficiency, the birthplace of prayer. As Rav Tzadok HaKohen Meilublin says, and the Rebbe even quotes from Tzidkas HaTzadik with this nekuda, is that Torah is where a person feels shlemus, corresponding to Zer Anpin, and tephila is where a person feels chasronos, associated with Malchus. Now, what the Rebbe does is he brings a story that he's brought before when Rav Baruch Ashlag, the son of the Baal HaSulam, the son of Rav Yehuda Leib Ashlag, came to his father before his wedding, and he said, Abba, give me a bracha. He said, I'm looking for a bracha. And the Baal HaSulam, instead of giving him a bracha, responded, he said, what am I supposed to give you a bracha for? You've completed Shas. You have Sidarim and Avodah. You've completed the Zohar. What else is there for me to give you a bracha for? Then his son got married. And after the chasana, at the Sheva Brachos, the Baal HaSulam came over to his son, Rav Baruch, and he said, now I can give you a bracha. Because now you've accomplished a connection with the concept of Malchus. You have connected yourself with that element in life which forces us to acknowledge our deficiencies. Marriage, for one example, connecting to the feminine quality of existence. And because you have connected yourself to Malchus, you have moved away from your sense of fullness and descended into a place of deficiency. So now you have what to receive a bracha from. Because there can be no bracha given without the receptivity towards a bracha. And without a sense of lack and deficiency, there's no room for a bracha to be given. That is what the Rebbe says the Baal HaSulam was trying to teach his son. So long as a person feels whole, total, complete, shalem in their avoda, there's no room for bracha to be chal. And the language of the Rebbe is so clear. The Rebbe says that there are certain people in the world who feel shalem b'li chesronos, who feel whole without any deficiency, v'zehu ba'atzmo hachisaron. And that in and of itself is the greatest deficiency. Because to live as if a person is whole is to miss the understanding of what it means to be a human being and a Jew, which is to take wholeness and connect that wholeness to a sense of deficiency, so that we can now enjoy the experience of wholeness associated with Zer Anpin and deficiency, which is associated with Malchus. The Rebbe continues and he says, Kedarcha B'Kodesh, just being mashalev, sugyos upon sugyos, which should really take us years to unpack. But he says, when a person looks at the writings of the Arizal, the whole Sidur HaDevarim in the Sefer Eitz Chaim is ultimately about this relationship between Zer Anpin and Malchus, between wholeness and deficiency, between a sense of completion and lack. And what we're told, now the Arizal says there are 7 levels in the relationship between the fullness of Zer Anpin and the deficiency of Malchus. And in the future, the Rebbe Rashab makes a diuk in Tafresh Nun Tes and elsewhere, and the Rashash also speaks of this, that there seems to be a level that the Ari only hinted to, which is when Zer Anpin and Malchus are going to be shav b'shav, when there is going to be an equality between the fullness of Zer Anpin, the fullness of that quality, and the element of deficiency. They're going to be revealed to have both been 2 elements of the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Yichud. So instead of living in that hierarchical relationship where we assume fullness and Zer Anpin is higher than deficiency and Malchus, in the future it will be revealed that in truth, Zer Anpin and Malchus are shav b'shav, are equal. And the Rebbe says as follows, how could it be? How could it be that shleimus, fullness, and deficiency, lack, are going to be revealed to be of equal footing? And this is an akuda that rests at the center of what the Rebbe is trying to say very often, Lefianias Daiti, is that if a person lives their lives with fullness alone, if a person lives their lives with a sense of completion as if they are perfect as they are, then there is a sense of boredom that eventually enters into a person's life. In the language of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, Tainug Tamidi Eno Tainug, perpetual pleasure, pleasure that exists without any deviation away from pleasure, without any knowledge of deficiency, grows boring, and it grows stifling, and it loses its element of pleasure. The tachlis is to somehow, some way allow pleasure and the opposite of pleasure, or fullness and the opposite of fullness, to interact together in such a way that the remembrance of deficiency gives birth to a new feeling of pleasure every moment, so that it's not enough for a person to live their life in the space of pleasure alone, of wholeness and the completion of Zer Anpin, because at that point, the person is missing a complete half of what Avodas Hashem is. The goal is to incorporate the sense of chisaron and lack and deficiency and desire and yearning and a sense of not being where we want to be and hoping towards something that is not present, and to incorporate that into the yichud so that every moment of pleasure that emerges from fullness is intensified through the remembrance of lack, so that each and every moment the person is experiencing a pleasure that arrives out of non-pleasure, and it keeps growing and growing and growing, because otherwise, if we were to forget about the chisaron in our lives, so then we would never be able to fully enjoy or experience the true shleimus, which is not only shleimus, but it's shleimus and chisaron b'vasachas. It's wholeness and deficiency operating at once. And this is where the Rebbe becomes very nuanced in the Nakuda that he's trying to say. It does not mean that in our sense of wholeness and perfection, we will still experience a form of lack and deficiency as something that is not present, as we typically associate with Malchus, as if Malchus is the Levana in its diminished state. In the future, Malchus will reveal itself to be the paradox of a fullness of lack, a certain sense of satisfaction that arrives specifically because we're missing something. So that the human experience, la'asid lavo, when we're able to unify these two elements of Zer Anpin and Malchus, is going to be the impossible paradox of wholeness and deficiency operating in unison. So that instead of feeling that deficiency is something that has to be gotten rid of, we learn even nowadays to elevate deficiency into our avoda, and instead of running away from it, we learn to appreciate it and give it its proper place. Now we're going to look at the Lashonos of the Rebbe right now, and he's also going to introduce us to at least one of my favorite Nekudos, which is from the Rishonim, which is from Rav Avram Abulafia, a Makubal Eloki who existed way before the Arizal did, but the Arizal himself and the Ramak gave the gushpanka of kashrus on this tzaddik. And Rav Avram Abulafia was, it could take a world to discuss a little bit of what it might mean for us. But let's just look at what the Rebbe says. So this is in Os Samach Tes. So Darash Marenu L'chvad HaChasan, right? The Rebbe was talking about a Chasan who was going to be getting married. And he said, and they said that Sipor Marenu Maisa, that the Rebbe told the story, Meharav HaKadosh of Baruch Shalom ben Harav HaKadosh Bal HaSulam, from the Bal HaSulam's son, Shelifnei Chupaso Bikesh Bracha Me'aviv HaKadosh, that before his wedding he asked for a bracha from his father. The Amar lo ma yesh li levarcha, haloi ata kvar shalim b'chol. What bracha do you want from me? Aren't you already whole with everything? Shalim b'Torah, you're whole in your Torah. Shekvar zachisa lios baki b'shasu poiskim leheter hara'a. You're already a posek. V'chein shalim atu umuflag b'avodas Hashem v'chulei. And you're also remarkably skilled in your avodah. V'rak acher chatanusai kara bal hasulam libnoi. And it was only after the chasana that the Bal HaSulam called his son, V'amar lo, ata shekvar hitkasharta ela malchus. Now that you have attached yourself to malchus and understood what malchus means in your life, shah malchus hu b'chinas chisaron, because malchus is the aspect of deficiency and lack. Hare ata kvar kli muchsher lekabel bracha. At this point, now you're ready to receive a bracha. She'ein makom lebracha ela lahashlamas makom hachisaron. Because the only place for bracha to be chal is when it is in a place that comes to fill a pre-existing deficiency. Ubazeh muvan. And from this story we understand, says the Rebbe, shemi sheshalim lelo chisaron, that somebody who is whole without any deficiency, harezeh ba'atzmo chisaron gadol. This in and of itself is the greatest deficiency. Shahalo bazeh shehu kvar shalim nistam kli kabalaso. Because by feeling that this person is whole, then they lose their ability to receive something that comes from beyond them. She'ein kabbalah ela b'makom hachisaron. For there is no reception, there is no acceptance of things that come from beyond you without an awareness of lack. And in parentheses it says, Hanikra b'lashon bal hasulam haratzon lakabel shu kli hakabbalah. So in the Kabbalah of the Bal HaSulam, there are two inyanim. There's a ratzon lahashpia and there's a ratzon to be makabel. And these two elements are kind of the substructure of all existence. But in this Nakuda, the Rebbe is saying, without chisaron, without a hargasha of chesronos, like we say, borei nefashos rabos v'chesronam, without that, there's no room to receive anything. V'im kain, says the Rebbe, yesh lehes kasher el ha-malchus. A person needs to connect to malchus, shetamid hi bebechinas palga, which is always perpetually in a state of being half. This is mukusher to machzis hashekel, but the Rebbe didn't connect it to this, but this is very much mukusher to the idea of the machzis hashekel, that at best what we can be is a half. Because only through the awareness of deficiency do we prepare ourselves to become a vessel and a receptacle to become more than what we actually are. Somebody who feels self-saturated with themselves has no need to desire more. And the Rebbe continues, Ubir morenu al pi hanal. And the Rebbe explained based on this, Masha matzinu b'divrei harav Avram Abulafia skusei ganalinu. And this is what the Rebbe explains based on the words of Rav Abulafia, Shahashleimus ha'amitis, that the true fullness of Avodas Hashem, hu lihiyos tamid bebechinas shalem v'chatzi, to be whole and half at once. Now, Rav Avram Abulafia was talking about thinking and meditating on the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and there was a need to meditate and to have kavanos on a full name and also half of the name. And this is what Rav Avram Abulafia refers to as the soid of Shalem V'chatzi. But the Rebbe is in a way that only the Rebbe can do, taking it from the context of Rabba Mabulafia, even though that's the avoida for tzaddikim, nevertheless, klapenu, with regards to us, this is applied to avodas Hashem. Our goal is to be shalim v'chatzi b'vasa achas. Ubior bezeh, the explanation is shehashalem maramez al shlemus mitzad hazer anpin. To be whole is our association with the element of zer anpin in the Torah. V'hainu shlemus mitzad tikkun amidus v'gadlus v'shlemus b'Torah, where we consider ourselves human beings, where we consider ourselves functional and whole. The chatzi, but what does it mean to be a chatzi? Mitzad hanukfa, from the aspect of malchus. At that place, a person has to always remember that they are only a half and that they are deficient. And no matter where I am, no matter what relative level of position I am on the spiritual rung of productivity, nevertheless, I have to always see to it as if I consider myself in lack and desiring and in need of something bigger than me to emerge into my life. And this is what we learn in Kabbalah, that in the future, Yisgale Shahazun Shav B'Shav, that in truth, Zer Anpin and Nukva are on equal playing fields. There's an equanimity between the two of them. Hainu Sheyitgale She'ein Chisaron Dahanuk Chisaron Amiti Chas V'Shalom, that in truth, this feeling of deficiency that we associate with Malchus is not the deficiency that we typically feel, which is that something is missing. Kefi hanira kehayom, like we see nowadays, pegam halevana betur chisaron amiti, which in our gullus and exilic mindset, we see this deficiency of Malchus as if something is actually missing. Ella kol hachisaron dahanuk, the entire concept of the lack associated with Malchus, hurak kidei lihios kli lekabalas hashefa ad ensof. It's only there to remind us that we always have to yearn for a higher source of fullness. Because if I felt that I was shulling without deficiency, then I wouldn't need to yearn anymore. And that would be a pegam, because then I would claim that I have experienced the fullness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, something that is anathema to the Rebbe. Because you can never experience the fullness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because human beings are always, by definition, deficient. And so this chasaron is not a lack in the sense that there's something that I'm missing. It's a fullness of lack. It's the presence of remembering that I always need to move forward. Ulahosif tamud hischadshus hatainug, and to perpetually be renewing the renewal of my pleasure. Shahalo tainug tamidi eno tainug, for we have already learned that perpetual pleasure is not pleasurable. Virak al yedei bechinas hachisaron dahanukva, and it's only by way of the deficiency associated with that feminine quality of receptivity, shehu bechinas davar hamatzrich tamid tosefes hashlama v'eschadshus, which represents that idea that there is something in the world that perpetually needs renewal and fulfillment. And far from retracting from the pleasure, it in fact allows the pleasure to intensify itself. From the experience of perpetual pleasure, which becomes boring and non-pleasurable, to the miracle and the paradox of tainug ha-mechudash tamid shu tainug ha-amiti, a tainug that is perpetual, but it doesn't lose its sense of pleasure because it is perpetually renewing itself. And there is an ever-present movement forward and returning backwards, always to remind us that shleimus, full shleimus, is an impossibility until HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides that that's where we're at. Now, just one more minute, al pi avoda. I mean, this is an akuda that's kulo al pi avoda. This is, I believe, how a person has to look at their life from aleph ad taf. Torah, mitzvahs, avoda, midos, psychology, everything. But one of the things that the Rebbe does more than any tzaddik, it seems, that preceded him, other than Rabbi Nachman, is that the chasronos of the individual, the chasronos in mitzias, the chasronos in the world, far from being a symptom that needs to be alleviated so that fullness can emerge, making us feel as if our imperfections are things that are dirty, we learn that the pnimius of the Torah is really telling us that chisaron is a fact of mitzias. Chisaron is not a deficiency. It is meant to be there. It is what allows us to fulfill what it means to be a human being. And to learn that shleimus alone is one thing, but to reach a level of shalem and chatzi b'vasachas, that's a much higher level.